In this lesson, we're going to talk about what's known as economic regulation, which is the regulation of the price and the entry into markets by firms. Economic regulation occurs and is rationalized as an intervention by government because of the monopolistic tendencies that are sometimes existed in the marketplace. So the diagram we're going to use, if you like to rationalize this kind of regulation, kind of intervention by government, is this same old monopoly diagram that we've discussed before. Upward sloping marginal cost, downward sloping marginal revenue, downward sloping demand. Quantity of the monopolist at the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. Find the price off the demand curve where the monopoly price P sub n is located. If it were a competitive industry, not a monopoly, you'd have the competitive price at the intersection of the marginal cost and demand curve, and that's labeled QC in the diagram for quantity, and the price is PC. So the quantity produced by the monopolist is too small. It generates this inefficiency called deadweight loss, and the price charged by the monopolist to the consumers are higher. So what should be done about this? It's an inefficiency. Should this government let it go? Should there be an intervention? Should there be regulation? And that's the issue we're going to consider now. Economic regulation, as defined by economists, means a situation where the government regulates a firm's price and entry into the industry. It limits the ability for firms to come into the industry. It's distinct from what is sometimes called social regulation, which would be environmental regulation, such as restrictions on how many miles per gallon cars must achieve coming out of the manufacturers' plants. That would be social regulation, different from economic regulation. We'll consider that later in this course. There's another kind of intervention by government called antitrust policy. We're going to consider that as well. That's where you're still addressing monopoly power, but the idea is to keep firms with too much monopoly power from forming or to break up such firms when they come into existence. This tries to prevent the collusion as well in terms of the form of price fixing, which can occur. There's other kind of regulation of firms, financial firms, largely for safety and soundness reason. We're going to consider those when we study financial markets in this course. But in all these cases of intervention by the government, we want to be sure that we examine carefully the rationale for that. We've indicated that there are advantages to the market system in terms of efficiency, and so we want to be sure that the rationale for government intervention holds and is, if you like, justified in each of these cases. And that's really what we're going to do today in this lesson for the case of economic regulation. So in particular, the rationale for this kind of economic regulation, which usually occurs by setting up an agency of government, sometimes called a public utility commission, they're created in order to set the price and restrict entry of firms into the market. This particular rationale for this kind of intervention is that there's a natural monopoly. Natural monopoly meaning a case where it's going to get lower average total cost by having one firm rather than more than one firm. Examples would be where you're delivering water to a house through pipelines or sewer lines or distributing electricity through wires to houses. It's a natural monopoly because once you've laid the main lines, it's just a matter of hooking up additional houses, and the more houses you can hook up, the lower the average total cost will be because you're covering really the large amount of fixed costs through the major lines when you hook up more houses. So it's declining average total cost. And you can see why that is a rationale with a kind of diagram like this. Now, this is a diagram you could say is a typical diagram for a natural monopoly. It's a case where there's decreasing average total cost throughout the entire range of production. Got quantity on the horizontal axis, dollars on the vertical axis. You see average total cost declining in this picture. And the certain points are marked to illustrate this. So if you look at the horizontal axis, there's an amount produced there, which we're assuming is produced by two firms. Or you could have one firm producing that amount, which would be the same because it would be one firm producing the whole amount or two firms producing that amount. Now, which is cheaper? Well, you can go up to this average total cost curve and find out. When two firms produce the same amount as one firm, the average total cost is up there, it's higher. But when only one firm is producing that amount, again, that amount is twice this amount, then the average total cost is lower. So with declining average total cost, you actually can get cheaper production, lower average total cost, and therefore lower price if you have one firm. So that's the natural monopoly, which is the most common rationale for economic regulation of price and entry into an industry. So let's consider what you do in the case of natural monopoly. Actually, first you want to be sure it is a natural monopoly. And sometimes it's not so clear. Maybe in the case of water and electricity it's clear, but a lot of times it's not. So consider cable TV, for example. Cable TV, there's a cable laid that goes to individual houses or apartments off of a main line. Is that a natural monopoly? Well, not so clear, because sometimes you can get a lot of channels over the air. That competes with cable. Or you can have satellite dishes. That competes with cable. Or there's even maybe new technologies. Perhaps you can bring some of the signals over the electricity lines that already exist. So there's potential competition in this case, and this is so often the case where things appear to be a natural monopoly, but then the technology changes and it brings competition, and it's no longer a natural monopoly. So you got to be really careful, make sure you got one before you consider this kind of intervention. But let's suppose you got it and you're clear what's going on, and then you want to examine the model to decide what we're going to do. So here's a picture of the natural monopoly. It's a usual axes that we've considered in the past, but we're doing a couple things to make it special and interesting. One is the average total cost is declining through the entire range of production. So you can see in the green line how it's coming down like that. It's down through the whole range like that. And you got the marginal cost, it's flat. That makes it a little easier too. Marginal cost is flat across the line here. Note that marginal cost is always below average total cost, as it must be when average total cost is declining, but it's flat. It could be upward sloping a little bit, but we make it flat just to make it a little easier. And after all, that's not such a bad approximation for many natural monopolies, because the cost of hooking up one additional house or one additional apartment with a water line or a sewer line or a cable is basically about the same for each one. So it's probably a pretty constant marginal cost. In any case, a little easier to look at. And now we draw in the typical demand curve in purple. It's labeled demand, and marginal revenue curve, labeled marginal revenue. We know in this case what the monopoly quantity will be. It's right at the intersection of marginal cost and revenue. It gives you your monopoly price. It's illustrated up there. We also know what the price would be with pure competition, but it's not there. Price would equal marginal cost. And you can imagine other things like price equal to average total cost, and it would generate that. These are just things driven off of the demand curve. So that's the natural monopoly model: downward sloping demand, market power, monopoly power, declining average total costs. Now let's consider alternative ways that the regulator could regulate the price. Really consider three different options. One we'll call marginal cost pricing, then we'll consider average cost pricing, and then we're going to consider something called incentive regulations. Really kind of three alternative ways to consider to regulate the price. So let's first consider marginal cost pricing. In the case of marginal cost pricing, it sounds pretty good, sounds pretty simple. The regulator, the Public Utilities Commission, will find out what the marginal cost is at the firm and say, firm, you can charge P equal marginal cost. If marginal cost is $100, you can charge $100 a month or whatever it happens to be for the service. That sounds pretty good. Price equals marginal cost would mean efficiency. We know that from our earlier studies, and it would mean no deadweight loss. However, let's look at the picture and see what's going on here, and you can see maybe this might not be exactly the right thing to do. So that's the same picture of the natural monopoly that we've looked at, and we want to examine whether price equal marginal cost is the right thing to do. So you can see in the picture where price equals marginal cost, that's that line right there, the price will be over there. In this case, the quantity demanded in the market will be there, and the firm can find out its cost by going to the average total cost curve. Now observe that average total cost at this point is greater than the price. Since average total cost is greater than the price, profits are negative. Economic profits are negative. who would go into this business of providing this service or good if it was going to lose money? No one. So price equal marginal cost might sound good, but it just doesn't work because it leads to economic losses. Price is too low compared to the cost of production at that point. So that's the disadvantage. The firm will earn negative profits, and who would bother to produce? And you can see that by taking a look at the diagram. So let's consider the second possibility. Suppose the regulator says, okay, firm, you set your price, we must have it equal to average total cost. Well, that sounds better. Let's see, profit's probably not going to be negative, but I'll check that out. It'll be zero. It won't be as high as the monopoly price. Let's check that out too. But let's take a look at the diagram and just see that. So this argument is the regulator should say to the firm, set the price equal to average total cost. And we know we've got to be on the demand curve all the time, so that's got to be at that point. Got to be on the demand curve, right? That's what price and quantity have to be. And so at that particular price, you'll get a production right down there, average total cost pricing. Of course, you're on the demand curve at that point, and you're at this point, just at the tangency point of the average, not at the tangency point, you're right at the point where average total costs cross the demand curve, right at that point, and therefore your profits are zero. Price equals average total costs. So that sounds good. And again, that particular price, which is over here, is less than the monopoly price. And so it's a lower price for the consumers than the monopolist would charge alone. So that sounds better than the other possibility. But there is still a problem here, and that is illustrated by the last bullet in this chart. And that is average total cost pricing actually creates terrible, bad incentives for the firm, because there's no reason for it to keep its costs down. If it has high average total cost, perhaps because the management takes corporate jets all over the place, it doesn't fly commercial, or they're just kind of sloppy, they don't really manage the firm very well, and that raises costs. If the regulator is just saying, okay, your price can be equal to average total cost, we're going to keep doing that, then there's really no incentive for the firm to be run properly. It provides really bad incentives that the regulator simply just matches any increase in cost, and therefore average total cost with a higher price. So average total cost pricing, again, may sound okay, but it has its disadvantages. The answer, in some sense, to this problem is called the third idea, which is incentive regulation. This is a situation where you try to set price equal to average total cost, but then you leave it there for a while, for a number of years, if you like. And you could basically make it rise with the overall inflation rate in the economy. If all prices are rising a certain amount, raise it. But the idea is not to simply match any increase in average total cost with a higher price. Basically, you stick to the higher price, whatever it is, $100 or $200, and you say, okay, that's what you can charge for the next several years. And the idea here now is that the firm has some incentives to monitor costs. The firm gets to keep any extra profits it makes without the regulator immediately changing the regulated price. And that's where the incentive comes from. If during this next few years the firm decides not to use so many corporate jets or to run the place better and it reduces its costs, it gets to keep the profits. Profits are going to be higher because the regulator will not right away cut the price to equal average total costs. And it also gives incentives for the firms to take actions that make even costs lower in the longer term as well. It's incentive to keep costs down, not to be sloppy. And in fact, if it goes the other direction in this case, and average total costs rise in this incentive regulation case, they're going to lose money because the regulator will not raise the price just because you're flying more corporate jets around. So the firm in general has the incentive to keep costs down with this, and it works pretty well. One other issue to consider when you're considering regulation is the possibility that the firms may not indicate all the information correctly to the regulator. The firm may know much more about what's going on in the market than the regulators could possibly know. So in this case, the firm may claim the costs are higher to the regulators than they really are. It's illustrated in this diagram, the same diagram with demand, marginal revenue, and marginal cost. The only difference is we've drawn in two average total cost curves. One, the true average total cost of production, what it really costs, and the other, what the firm might convey to the regulator. The firm having more information, it might have the ability to do this. So it represents higher average total costs. And the purpose of doing this is recognizing that the regulator is setting price equal to average total cost might actually give the opportunity for the firm to charge a higher price. So look carefully at the way this is drawn. The average total cost curve is way up here. And at that high average total cost, if the regulator says, okay, you can set a price equal to that average total cost, in this case it's actually the monopoly price, because that's the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost for the quantity, and you got the price off the demand curve. So in fact, it's possible. Regulators have to be careful that this doesn't happen in this case. It's possible to claim the cost is so high you almost get back to the monopoly price. In this case, literally, you do get back to the monopoly price. So having said all this, let's consider where this economic reasoning has come to play in public policy discussions. For a long time, back in the 1970s, it continued in the 80s, and in the 90s it's somewhat diminished now, there was something called the deregulation movement. And it occurred largely because of the arguments made in this kind of lesson. Economists argued that many regulated industries weren't actually natural monopolies. There was more competition than you thought. And so the natural monopoly argument, which we've gone through, didn't really apply. And there were a lot of examples of this, where the price and entry regulations were actually in play in airlines, railroads, telecommunications, trucking, but then they were pulled out, they were actually reduced. In the case of air travel, there was a Civil Aeronautics Board that determined prices for travel by airlines and restricted entry to certain airports by the airlines. People realized, well, there's more competition than you think. You can have smaller planes flying to smaller airports or get more airlines into the same airport. So there's more competition. So they pulled off this regulation in the late 70s. They, of course, continue to regulate for safety and soundness of the aircraft, but the notion of regulating the price is gone, and there's fierce competition in that industry. Railroads were also regulated by price, the argument being that it was a natural monopoly to only have one railroad line between two cities. You didn't have two railroad lines. So the natural monopoly argument seemed to apply quite well, except, of course, competition came, and roads were built, and you had airlines and other means of travel and shipping between cities. And so the rationale for railroad regulation, which existed for a long time after this competition existed, came to play. That rationale went away. Same with telecommunications. It used to be the only way to have telephone service was through wire lines, not only into a neighborhood, but across the country. That eventually disappeared with telecommunications technology, and now cell phones are used all over the place without any wires. With the telecommunications case, it was a natural monopoly. It looked like a natural monopoly in the past. It certainly doesn't now. There's no reason to regulate the price of a cell phone, and we don't regulate it, where we used to regulate the price of the kind of old-fashioned phones that used to sit on people's desks or on walls. And finally, trucking, the same thing. Trucking used to be regulated in terms of price. It no longer is. So this is the deregulation movement. Economists who studied it seem to find that the prices were a lot lower as a result. Air travel, railroads, telephones, trucking prices came down. There was more, and actually more production as well. So just as the theory would project, if you have more competition, it really served even much better than the goal that those regulatory activities had. There's been a movement away from deregulation recently, partly because a lot of progress has been made, probably less progress to be made because of that, progress made in the past, but also because of the financial crisis in 2008. A lot of people argue that that became because of deregulation of financial institutions. We're going to want to consider that carefully, so stay tuned to that consideration. But for the most part, the kind of regulations we're considering here, these economic regulation, price and entry regulation, are different from the safety and soundness regulations. So it's important to make that distinction clear in public policy discussions. Deregulation movement we're referring to here has to do with price and entry regulation, and for the most part, economists find that it was effective for the reasons we've made clear, I think, in this lesson. Thank you.